debate. The Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to begin, if I can, today by thanking the voters of Ottawa South, Madam Speaker. This is my 7th consecutive election. I am honoured and privileged to represent such a magnificent riding, a very diverse riding with over 82 languages spoken, well over 160 countries of origin, Madam Speaker. I like to describe my riding as the United Nations of Ottawa South. Madam Speaker, a great deal of time has already been spent describing the objectives of Bill C-5, its proposed reforms and the expected impacts. I support these changes, and I believe they will make a significant positive contribution to our criminal justice system. They'll also contribute to efforts to address the undeniable disproportionate impacts that existing criminal laws have on certain communities in Canada. We know that certain communities in Canada and in other countries are involved in the criminal justice system at higher rates than other people. In Canada, the over-incarceration of Indigenous persons and Black Canadians is well documented. Many of these reasons are systemic, including our laws on sentencing. It's clear to me that the issue of an over-incarceration must be addressed by revisiting our existing sentencing laws, and that is exactly what Bill C-5 proposes to do. Canada is not alone in recognizing that the increased and indiscriminate use of mandatory minimum penalties, or MMPs, has proven to be a costly and ineffective approach to reducing crime. Indeed, many jurisdictions comparatively around the world are moving away from this approach to criminal justice. While MMPs can be a forceful expression of government policy in the area of criminal law, we know that MMPs do not deter crime and can result in unjust and inequitable outcomes. The Supreme Court of Canada, Madam Speaker, has been very clear about these issues. Criminal justice policy is not developed in a vacuum. Evidence-based policy is informed by relevant research, including comparative studies from other countries. By examining a particular policy's successes and failures, we can develop reforms that build on what we know works and addresses what we know does not. For instance, while the United States, both at the federal and the state levels, has historically made great use of MMPs, in the last decade, many states have moved toward reducing or outright eliminating mandatory sentences, with a particular focus on nonviolent and drug-related charges. These trends reveal a shift that is motivated by, amongst other things, a need to address high levels of incarceration and the corresponding social and fiscal costs. Just speak to a California legislator about how expensive it has been for the state of California over the last several decades. This is being done by governments of all political stripes in the United States, and I encourage all parties in this House to recognize the true impacts of MMPs and work to improve our criminal justice system. Some in the United States have termed this as a, quote, smart on crime movement. This approach recognizes the need to address high levels of incarceration of young Black and Hispanic Americans who are disproportionately negatively impacted by the use of mandatory minimum sentencing laws in the United States, particularly, as I've already noted, for nonviolent drug-related offenses. Some have also pointed out that mandatory minimum sentencing actually encourages cycles of crime and violence by subjecting nonviolent offenders who could otherwise be productive members of society to the revolving door of the prison system. Recently, the President of the United States indicated his intention to repeal MMPs at the federal level, where he has jurisdiction, and provide states with incentives to repeal their own mandatory minimums as well. Other countries, colleagues, have made similar changes. For example, in 2014, France repealed certain MMPs, predominantly citing evidence showing that the reconviction rate had more than doubled between 2001 and 2011, increasing from 4.9% to 12.1%. Madam Speaker, when examining trends in like-minded countries, we can see a clear policy shift towards limiting the use of mandatory minimum penalties to the most serious of cases and restoring judicial discretion at sentencing. While international comparisons cannot be the only lens through which we develop sentencing policy in Canada, particularly given our unique cultural traditions and diversity, such comparisons provide a useful backdrop against which to assess the adequacy of our own sentencing laws. Currently, the Criminal Code and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act provide MMPs for 73 offences, including for firearms offences, sexual offences, impaired driving, kidnapping, human trafficking, sex trade offences, murder, high treason, and drug-related offences such as trafficking, import, export, and production of certain drugs, for example, cocaine and heroin. 30 offences have been amended in the last 15 years, almost entirely by the previous Harper government, to increase existing MMPs or to impose new ones. Now, Madam Speaker, I was in this House when those amendments were made by the previous government, when those measures were introduced, and I had an opportunity to debate them at the time. I was opposed to them then, and I'm opposed to them now. But what I was particularly struck by, Madam Speaker, at the time, was that evidence had been presented to the House, produced by the Criminal Law Policy Division in the Department of Justice, whose director happened to be a former Progressive Conservative Member of Parliament. And the evidence which was adduced and presented by the Department of Justice indicated that the amendments that the government of the day was pursuing would not achieve the outcomes that they desired. They had been warned and forewarned not only by opposition members at the time, but by the think tank inside our Department of Justice. Well, Bill C-5 will reverse that trend, and in so doing, it seeks to make the criminal justice system fairer and more equitable for all. It would repeal MMPs for 20 offences, including MMPs for all drug-related offences, as well as some for firearm-related offences. This isn't a signal from Parliament that drug and firearms offences are not serious and are not worthy of important denunciatory sentences in appropriate cases. Firearms and drug offences can be very serious, and I have full confidence in our courts to impose appropriate penalties. Bill C-5, as I said, would not repeal all MMPs in the Criminal Code. This bill does not propose changes to the penalties for child sexual offences and other sexual crimes, nor would the mandatory penalty of life imprisonment for murder be changed. Some will argue that the government should have done away with all mandatory minimum penalties. Others will be critical of the government's decisions to reform the MMPs that are included in this bill. This bill is an important and balanced step forward, and I know that our Justice Minister is always open to considering further changes in the future. So despite there being differences of opinion, Madam Speaker, as to the role of MMPs in our sentencing laws, I would not want these used to distract us from our job, which is to examine the important changes in Bill C-5. We have a good bill before us that has been welcomed by a broad range of stakeholders. It makes critically important changes, not just in the area of MMPs, but also with respect to conditional sentencing and to the way the criminal justice system addresses simple drug possession. I will be voting in favour of these changes, Madam Speaker, because I am convinced they will make our justice system fairer and better. I urge all members on all sides of this House to support the swift passage of Bill C-5. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park versus Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech and congratulate him on his re-election. He began his speech talking about how certain historically marginalized communities, for instance, Black and Indigenous Canadians, are disproportionately represented in the prison population. Now, it seems clear that one possible cause of that over-representation is that members of certain communities are receiving disproportionately long sentences relative to others for the same crime. And it would seem that one way of combating racism in the justice system is to ensure consistent sentencing, that people, regardless of their background, regardless of their of their race, for instance, are receiving similar kinds of sentences for the same crimes in the same circumstances. So one way of reducing that racism would be to have clear sentencing guidelines. Perhaps it's mandatory minimums, perhaps it's sentencing starting points. By this legislation, by removing mandatory minimums, widening the range for judicial discretion, it doesn't seem on that basis then to be combating discrimination. Rather, it creates more space for the inconsistent application of penalties for the same crime. I wonder if the member has a comment on that.
Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Although I would be desirous of seeing the kind of consistency that he alludes to, Madam Speaker, one size does not fit all. One size does not fit all. When there is a crime being adjudicated at court, judges have a specific responsibility to adduce and to hear all of the evidence, to consider the evidence, to take into consideration background, mental health, addiction. We've heard here repeatedly on the floor of the House, Madam Speaker, that this question of addiction is, on some sides of the House, considered to be a weakness, perhaps even a choice. Well, addiction is the antithesis of being free, Madam Speaker. When one is addicted, one is not free to make necessarily rational choices. So the answer to the question the member poses is one size does not fit all, and trying to force fit every case into a box that the kind that the previous government forced, I think, has led, we see now, to the kind of evidence we know to be the case, which is a small percentage of a population, for example, Indigenous Canadians, being widely overrepresented in the prison system.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. I'd like to hear more on the importance of retaining discretion and flexibility for judges when sentencing, depending on the circumstances of the case, of the offender, whether it's a repeat offender or whether it's a young person under some bad influence. I'd like him to elaborate on that and tell us whether he thinks the sentences for what he thinks about sentences for trafficking in illegal arms, which is our main concern.
If I could, just where I left off, and that is the role and purpose of judges and the difficult role that they fulfill when they sit as triers of fact. I remember when I began my career as a young articling student, Madam Speaker, with a criminal law firm, I was struck by the difficulty that judges face when these cases are presented to them. I was also struck by the connection between criminal activity and mental health and addiction. We know this to be true. And we've seen the kinds of complexity which is put before courts, which calls for the kind of judicial freedom for judges to be able to assess meaningfully and to find other opportunities to deal with a serious situation. This bill does not do away with all mandatory minimum sentences. I've said that in my remarks. There is room, there are occasions when that's the case, but I think we need to make sure that judges maintain that flexibility.
The Honourable Member for Courtney Alberni.
Madam Speaker, over 25,000 lives have been lost due to a poison drug supply since this government came into power. Now, they've heard from health professionals, police chiefs, addiction specialists, experts, Madam Speaker, that continue, even their own panel from Health Canada on their experts on substance use, giving them clear direction and guidance to decriminalize use of drugs and to provide a safe supply. It's the first steps. Madam Speaker, yet they haven't responded. Vancouver's waiting. BC's waiting on their exemption. Madam Speaker, I truly believe, and maybe my colleague can help me with this if he also agrees, that it's politics that are getting in the way, and politicians, by not taking bold and courageous action. And if the Liberals truly believe this is a health issue, will they, Madam Speaker, treat this as a health issue and listen?
A very short answer from the Honourable Member for Ottawa South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The answer is yes, we are treating this as a health issue. Yes, this government remains open to the concept of decriminalization based on evidence, based on comparative experience, and I would encourage the member to bring that evidence forward to committee when this bill is being treated. Thank you.